afternoon, and welcome to panel 6 on Conflict 2. Our panel is called Aspects of Conflict Encounters of Memory. And we have quite a packed panel, 5 papers in this panel. The speakers are duly prepared and ready for 15 minutes. Slow, interpreter-friendly 15-minute talks. And I am very delighted to start with Michael Shafir, Emeritus Professor at the Institute for Doctoral Studies at Babeș-Bolyai University in Romania.
Good morning. In the 15 minutes I have to speak on a clash of memories, I think it's better to speak about the impossible clash of time restraint. Therefore, I shall totally go off the focus of my prepared thing, and I'd like to start with describing very briefly 3 small films, if you want, which have been either recently presented in East Central Europe or about 2-3 years ago. And let me start with the latest in the order, and that is a musical which is going to be on stage in Latvia, and whose main character, if I were to employ social realist terms, positive character, is a guy named Herbert Cukurs. Now, Herbert Cukurs fought the Russians as a member of the Waffen-SS, and also happened to be number 2 in the battalions that exterminated the Jews without even waiting for the for the Nazis enters to the place, doing the job for them. He is the example presented in a very positive light. Let me go now to the second example. And that comes from the country where I live nowadays, Romania, where about 3 years ago a movie was presented whose positive hero was a guy named Ion Gavril Ogoranu. He died in the meantime. He died, in fact, before the movie was made. And his heroic struggle against the communists by becoming a partisan in the mountains is presented in detail and historically rather accurate. However, there is one thing that the movie that has no word about. Ion Gavril Ogoranu was an Iron Guardist, a true believer in the Iron Guard. Was at the end, he was caught, but due to the intervention of President Nixon, he was let free. He died after the fall of communism, and to illustrate how much he was dedicated to his ideals, even now his coffin was wrapped up in the Iron Guard, the Romanian fascist movement flag, and before he died, he established a political party which went under the name of Everything for the Fatherland, and which was exactly the name of the Iron Guardist party at one time. Example number 3, a very successful documentary, let me call it so-called documentary, showed everywhere in the former communist world with much success by an Estonian stage director whose name I don't recall right now, has, among other things, a scene in which the Soviets and the Nazis are shown to be marching together in a town which was liberated by the Soviets in Poland to let the Nazis in when the country was divided. Now, there was never such a march, and what in fact happened was that, yes, the Soviets withdrew, the Nazi came in, and in between the guy put sequences from a Red Army march in November 7 or 1 May or nothing, giving the feeling that, look, Nazis and Soviets were marching together, although this was so brief entirely that people who look at it may wonder where are the Nazis, because the Soviets are there. Now, this movie, and that is more important, starts and goes on and on in Turkey with a so-called quotation from Karl Marx. And Karl Marx says in that quotation that when the communists take over power, there's need to be, the bourgeoisie is going to be cleansed, and if it takes a Holocaust, so what? Now, all you people, I suppose, whether you have or not an interest, realize that Marx couldn't have used the word Holocaust. It simply didn't exist at his time. And when one goes and verifies the quotation, two things appear. A, not one, but two articles intercalated with 3 dots. B, not Marx, but Marx and Engels. So, and the question rises, why falsify something? And the answer is simple. If he had Engels there, he couldn't have really made the point. And the point was that Marx was Jewish. And the point is that communism was brought by Jews. And the point is that, and here I come to competitive memory, we have done unto them what they have done unto us before. This is called the thesis of double genocide, and this appears prominently in the post-communist narrations in different forms, with one possible exception, and this is this country, as I understood, where very rarely you find that, but all over the other, and particularly in the Baltic countries, where it also actually started in Lithuania, in the Baltic countries, in all the countries that were affected by the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, but also in those that were not affected by the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And here I very briefly want to state that this led to what a researcher, a Lithuanian Yiddish professor who lives there, has called the general tendency of Holocaust obfuscation. Why obfuscation? Well, of course, obfuscation comes from focus, badly focused, obfuscation, and this means that the Holocaust, in fact, is presented in a way that leads people to a sort of self-exculpation as a community. As I said, we did them, what they accuse us of. Yes, but we had a good reason for it. They brought communism on us. And B, that is a demonstration, in fact, and I was trying to work it out through my paper, Richard. This is not a clash of historians, but a clash of memories. And how do memories emerge and are transmitted is very central to understanding this phenomenon. Now, memory under communism was, as somebody put it, whispered. It passed on from generation to generation, but nobody could really pronounce it. And now it comes out in this unlimited form. Do all these people who, for good reason, hated communism, not very few fought it, but do all these people realize what they are doing? I believe they are not. Because what happens is a 3- or 4-fold phenomenon. There is no reason we shouldn't take concepts which were designed from research on the Gulag and not to apply on the Holocaust, and not to apply it to communism and the Gulag. And one central concept, of course, is Marianne Hirsch's concept of post-memory. We do not deal here, or deal very little with real memory. Most of these people are dead, but we deal with the memories that were passed from one generation to the other in families. Now you may ask, why would a good, decent anti-communist, and I'm not ironical when I say decent, want to associate with people like Ogorani? There's a very simple answer to that. They suffered together, not they themselves, but even their families, because if, let me, the Magyar Kisgazda party, Hungarian little owners party, was put into prison, and his family persecuted. And also persecuted was a family of a former Arrow Cross fascist movement. Now this created a solidarity among them that was passed on without asking those questions, because so much suffering went on together. This is one thing. The other thing is, paradoxically enough, this is a result of the success of the Holocaust story. Transforming the Holocaust into the paradigmatic genocide makes these people feel, hey, what about our suffering? Okay, but why call that genocide? Because no, there was no genocide under communism, and I put here full stop, and I provoke you to that because I don't have the time. There was no genocide under communism, not even in the Ukraine. Why use genocide when you could use the infringement of human rights, which is punished at international level exactly like the genocide? Both are imprescriptible, no status of limitation. Well, because the feeling is that nobody takes you seriously if you don't say genocide. So in Romania recently we had a report which spoke of the communist genocide, when in fact it referred to the peasants. Now, genocide is destroying a nation. And I won't go into detail what what was wrong there. I see I have 1 minute left, so I'll end by saying that, using again concepts from Holocaust, it is not the paradigm that changes. The paradigm remains the same. What changes, however, is the dominant story. The dominant story under communism is resistance to communism, just as, or transforming heroes as those who resisted, just as in the case of Holocaust studies. This is so, and to really provoke you, I'll tell you that in both cases we deal with myth and not legend. That is not to say that the Holocaust is a myth, that is not to say sufferings under communism is myth. But myth, my dear friends, I use the Sorevian terms, which means a thing that can mobilize without asking question. I have many friends, Jewish friends in Romania, who have no idea what Holocaust, what Jewishness is. Mention Holocaust and they are behind you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shafir, for a talk which spoke on many levels to many key concepts like memory, post-memory, myth, history, obfuscation. Everything was in there. Thank you very much. Without further ado, we pass on to Lisa Jenny Krieg, who is currently doing her PhD in cultural anthropology at Utrecht University, and a talk called "When You Mention the Holocaust, It's Like BAM."
Thank you. First of all, I'll diverge a bit from my abstract in the Book of Abstracts. I cut some conceptual parts and instead added some empirical parts. I don't know if anyone even read the Book of Abstracts, but anyway, as a start. So my paper is going to be about two different kinds of uncomfortable experiences in encounters with the Holocaust for young German adults. And I'm going to talk about two different educational contexts, a museum and a school. And then I'll move to the role of emotions for the creation of these situations and the different relevance of emotion for each of the groups who participated in my research. But first, a bit about my research and my background. As Felicitas said, I'm a third-year PhD student in cultural anthropology in Utrecht. And the main research question that guides my research is the relationship of young German adults. People I look at are born roughly in the 1980s with the Holocaust today. I did, as anthropologists usually do, field research. In 2013, I spent 9 months in Cologne, and I worked with the tour guides of the Documentation Center for National Socialism in Cologne, and with adult students of an evening high school, and I did participant observation in their history classes and German literature classes. I spent 3 months in like all the history lessons on National Socialism and the Holocaust, and I went on the guided tours in the museum with the tour guides, went to their workshops and team meetings, and I also conducted several interviews with the participants and also with the history teacher and the museum educator. And the issues that interest me and that I focus on are experience, embodiment, and the construction of agency of the Holocaust, how Germans with immigration background relate to the Holocaust, and also hopefully I'll do a bit more on taboo and social control in that context. So for a start, the most common experience that was mentioned by my research participants when dealing with the Holocaust was discomfort. Learning about the past was for many an uncomfortable experience, and I think in that respect my paper or my findings are going to challenge a lot of what we have seen yesterday about very emotional approaches to the Holocaust. So I'm gonna start off with giving you 2 examples of this kind of discomfort. We're sitting at a small table in a big stylish cafe in Cologne, where all the furniture looks like it was bought on a flea market. Tour guide Dennis and I are immersed in our conversation. He tells me about an episode he recently witnessed at his work in the museum. He entered the museum to meet the school class he was supposed to guide. Contrary to normal, when dealing with a group of teenagers, he didn't hear them making noise.
Point more directly.
He said, "It was suspiciously quiet. I entered, looked around the corner, and see how 2 boys are standing opposite each other. It was a weird situation. Then the teacher came running up to me and said, 'Let's go outside.' And outside she told me, 'We're getting into the mood in order to be shocked.' It looked like they're doing role games." Dennis laughs and shakes his head. He continues, "If students grow up like that, well, that leaves marks. They won't forget that." Change of scenes. Adrian and I are sitting in a small room in the big ugly building of the evening high school in Cologne. There is only space for 1 table and 2 chairs. We've 1 hour before classes start. Adrian is warming up. Also in class, he's never one to hold back. I ask him, "Which role did the Holocaust play for you during your life?" He thinks about it a bit and replies, "As a kid, it was less important. At school, it was blown up pretty big. In middle school, it annoyed the crap out of me after 2 years. They forced it on us. That was really annoying. Sure, it's an important part of German history. You have to know it. But they talked us into this war guilt. I didn't like that. Because I don't have anything to do with it. I didn't do anything. And what my ancestors did, I can't change. So yeah, that's how it often felt." So obviously, confronting violent pasts and learning about history in class does not need to be uncomfortable. It can also be, as we heard, enlightening, inspiring, relieving. But in my field research, most experiences that the participants shared with me were indeed uncomfortable ones. From all this data I gathered, I generalized, and I found many 2 kinds of uncomfortable situations. The first one is an immediate and direct lived experience framed by emotional exposure to horrors of the past. This is frequently accompanied by very strong emotions and also discomfort. This corresponds to the scene depicted by Dennis, where students were exposed to a very emotional situation which they could not escape. The intent of the role game he described appeared to be triggering feelings of sadness and shock. And I heard many similar stories about this kind of being exposed to shock, to very strong emotions, to not being able to escape from these situations, and feeling very uncomfortable in that context. Also, many participants told about how they do not voluntarily expose themselves to these situations because it's too shocking for them. For example, to see these photographs of piles of corpses, or how they, if they do so, like watching Schindler's List is such a strong experience that they think about it and feel bad for a week afterwards. The second kind of experience corresponds to the one Adrian described. It's a different experience. It's not one of being force shocked, but of being inscribed into a narrative of national guilt against one's will. And in this kind of encounter, one's life experience guides the experience and creates the discomfort, which is the knowledge of former and similar experiences and the knowledge of the kind of emotionality that one is expected to display. So, my first conclusion here is that emotions are a key to the creation of discomfort and encounters with the Holocaust. Too much emotion or the experience of emotional manipulation can escalate a situation quickly and create discomfort. Now, for every group I worked with, emotions played a different role, and how they managed emotions and how they related to them and what they could do for them was very different. So now I'm going to give you an overview about the relevance of emotions for the museum educator, who was responsible for training the tour guides, then of the role of emotions for the museum tour guides themselves, for the history teacher of the evening school, and then for the evening school students. So, the museum educator of the Documentation Center for National Socialism told me, many people learned through youth literature and early experiences that this, the Holocaust, is a very, very sad topic, and they don't always feel like that. In my childhood, the most important book was Heidi. That's the story of a girl living in the mountains. The first time I read the whole book, there was this very sad part, when she left the mountains and moved to Frankfurt. The first time I found it just terribly sad. The second time I read until Frankfurt, skipped that part, and continued where she returned to the mountains. Being sad once was enough for me in that context. I think it's similar with the Holocaust. You're really, really sad once. And who wants to be sad over and over again? Her view illustrates pretty well the policy of the museum. The whole exhibition and the whole idea of the museum is rather rational. It does not try to make people sad, and it does not force emotionality and depth on the visitors. Instead, it offers many levels of accessibility. It offers many documents, stories, photographs that people can decide how deeply they want to indulge in it. And the deeper one digs into the exhibits, the more closely one looks and reads the details of the documents, the more emotional the experience can become. But this is not prescribed to the visitor. I'll move to the next group, the museum tour guides. They make an effort, and they are supposed to do so, not to force emotions on the school classes they guide. They mainly guide school classes. Nevertheless, this is, of course, realized in different manners. So one guide admitted to me that she's still satisfied when she sees the emotions on the pupils' faces, because that appears to her like she reached her goal. Many times, even though not intentionally introduced to the tours, emotions appear during the tours. One of the main parts of the museum is the cellar, which was a Stasi prison during the Second World War, where people were tortured and killed. And still today there are inscriptions on the walls with pens and lipstick that bear witness to the fate of the prisoners. And the cellar is in a especially emotional location, and sometimes people cry there. The tour guides also express that they want to give room for these emotions when they appear. And at the same time, they find it sometimes hard to control their own emotions. Okay. One guy said, I know that when I'm guiding a tour, that when I say something I said 100 times before, I almost start crying because I'm so moved. That's not easy, because I have a special role when I'm the guide. That's not a space for me to show emotions. I hope I'm guiding in a way that the pupils can do that. Sometimes they cry, but I think I'm in a different role there. Emotions are very important issues for the guided tours, and the memory of how one felt when dealing with the Holocaust remains much longer than the memory of facts. And about this, one tour guide said, facts are not important, emotions are much more significant. If the students leave the museum and confuse all the dates and facts, I don't care, as long as they have a feeling about how it could have been. The third group, the history teacher of the class I worked with, told me, it's difficult to teach. I think on the one hand you have to try to be rational, keep to the facts. At the same time, you can't only stay with the facts because it's a very emotional topic. But my opinion is that you can't make it too emotional and too moral, because then people refuse to listen. The lessons focused mainly on facts and on the complexity of political social life in Nazi Germany. The teacher brought a lot of original material. He tried to show the many facets of the Third Reich and the decisions of normal people. He only rarely brought moral messages and only set limits when he felt that someone was relativizing crimes. He tried to create a space for emotion, but didn't force it on the students. So he would sometimes talk about his own emotions, how he is shocked when he sees or hears something, and he also mentioned his own family background and how he accused his parents and how his parents wouldn't answer his questions and how that was hard for him. And for him, emotions were also a challenge in the respect that he had to balance the different emotional needs of students. So while some students would get upset when something was said, other students were very provocative, and he was trying to balance. The last group, the students of the history class, they were pretty positive about the lessons in which I also participated. They felt respected, taken seriously, liked the rational style. And for them especially, emotions were very ambiguous. issue because it kept them fascinated in the topic, it kept them interested. Sometimes I would hear conversations about people having, like after or before class, like a competition about who saw the most horrible and terrifying documentary about death camps and medical experiments. And on the other hand, they were also immensely critical of attempts of emotional manipulation, and it made them very, very angry, and they refuted these kind of messengers directly. This leads me to my second conclusion. Emotions are risky. All of my research participants agreed that you can teach the Holocaust or approach the Holocaust without emotions, but still, using emotions in Holocaust education is like playing with fire. They are a very risky resource. They can, on the one hand, create lasting learning effects and keep people fascinated, but on the other side, just a tiny bit too much or evaluating the power of emotions wrongly can turn interested listeners against you, make them shut down and get angry. And this is also the quote that's the title of my lecture is, that was one of the tour guides said that when you mention the Holocaust, it's like, boom, you're slapped in the face, you gotta swallow it. And then you're caught up in these patterns, maybe also your own patterns of thought. You're not free anymore. So emotions, they're both a resource and capital. They are a currency and part of the self. And in Holocaust education, the emotionality of both educators and educated ones can't be ignored. Emotions can be used to communicate a message, but only under very specific conditions. And so I suggest that it might make sense to talk here about emotional capital. Once your emotional capital is established in a social context, you can use it. I imagine it as a kind of social capital that establishes you as an emotional person. That means in simple words that you have to earn respect on the emotional level. If you overuse your emotional capital, you destroy it and you won't be able to use it as a resource anymore. But it also means that you can't just simply come and work on the emotional level with people that you don't know because you haven't established your emotional capital yet. So as a final word, in the context that I witnessed, successful Holocaust education entailed creating a space for emotions, but not a focus on them. It entailed using emotion like a pinch of salt and not like a thunderstorm. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa Jenny Craig, for a very empirically rich discussion of a topic which was mentioned in a more programmatic way yesterday, the emotions and the challenges and possibilities of using emotions in educational context. Our next speaker is Katka Wolna, who I'm very pleased has been able to join us after participating in the municipal elections earlier today. Katka Wolna is currently doing her PhD in modern history at the Faculty of Social Sciences in Charles University here in Prague. And her talk is called Memory is the Source and Pointer of Efforts at Rectification. Katka.
It's going to be a check, maybe say it before.
Anybody who needs this talk.
They have to switch off their mics.
Did you switch off your mic? This talk is going to be in Czech, so if anyone needs a headset for the interpreters, they're in the hall.
Dobré odpoledne. Já se ještě jednou omlouvám za pozdní příchod, ale postavit tu konferenci v den, kdy já musím odjet z Prahy, volit někam jinam a pak se vracet, pro mě nebylo úplně komfortní, ale měla jsem si to lépe naplánovat. Nyní tedy již k tématu. Připojuji se k díkům, které tady zaznívají v úvodu přednášek mých kolegů směrem k organizátorům za zařízení toho, že se tady můžeme sejít na konferenci s tímto tématem. Doplním k tomu, že můj příspěvek se bude týkat minulosti a paměti právě jedné z pořadatelských institucí, Filozofické fakulty. A je to minulost vlastně spíše neslavná, jak bude doloženo. Uvědomila jsem si při přípravě toho příspěvku, že vlastně by se dalo podobným způsobem přistoupit k paměti a minulosti druhé pořádající instituce Ústavu pro studium totalitních režimů, ale to nechám na někdy jindy, případně do diskuze. Budu se tedy věnovat poválečné minulosti Filozofické fakulty, což je největší humanitní fakulta v naší zemi a jednoznačně bývala vnímaná jako jedna z nejdůležitějších humanitních a intelektuálních institucí pro Českou, dříve Československou republiku. Vidíte její hlavní budovu, ona jinak je dost roztříštěná ještě v jiných budovách a její historie je taky taková roztříštěná. Zároveň je hodně bohatá ta poválečná historie na zlomové okamžiky, které vlastně víceméně kopírují zlomové okamžiky celé naší země. Fakulta s nimi byla hodně spjatá a v některých obdobích byla sama i aktérem a iniciátorem toho, co se ve společnosti dělo. Hodně se v tom smyslu hovoří o roli Pražské fakulty a jejich pedagogů v době Pražského jara a pak samozřejmě přelom roku 89 bývá také zpět s vysokými školami, byť zde zrovna je role Filozofické fakulty a trochu diskutabilnější. Já se budu věnovat 3 specifickým textům, které jsou důležité nebo byly důležité pro akademickou obec této fakulty. Vznikly na ní během několika desetiletí minulého století. Jde o rehabilitační zprávu z roku 1968, analýzu z roku 1971 a pak rehabilitační zprávu z roku 1992. Ty texty mají společné to, že reflektují jak minulost společenskou a institucionální, tak částečně i osobní minulost vlastně autorů těchto zpráv, jejich kolegů a jejich studentů. Každý z těch dokumentů vlastně ale interpretuje to předchozí dějinné období s jinými akcenty a s jiným vyzněním, což samozřejmě souvisí s aktuální politickou situací v zemi. Ty texty spojuje i to, že jsou z větší části sestavené profesionálními historiky a pedagogy fakulty, kteří tak vlastně ustavují paměť instituce na určité období a předkládají různé pohledy na vlastní minulost a na události, které nehýbaly tedy jenom tou fakultou, ale celou společností. Jak vidíte, tak se značně liší rozsahem. Ta rehabilitační zpráva z roku 68 je poměrně stručný dokument, zároveň je brilantně formulovaný. Analýza z roku 1971 naopak se svými 700 stranami má velký rozsah, velký rozptyl žánrů, stylů a i jakoby má velmi rozkolísanou vnitřní úroveň. Rehabilitační zpráva z roku 92, já se k tomu dostanu potom, až budu mluvit přímo o ní, ale ta vlastně není jakoby jedním dokumentem, je to takovým dochovaným torzem několika dokumentů, které se dochovaly potom po těch 90. letech, takže není to úplně kompletní materiál, ten by byl širší, ale to, co se dochovalo, to je tedy těch necelých 70 stran. Rehabilitační zpráva z roku 1968 je v podstatě důsledkem procesu Pražského jara. Vznikala v rehabilitační komisi na Filozofické fakultě, která ovšem byla stranická, a pracovali tam zástupci, kteří byli delegováni jednotlivými stranickými fakultními organizacemi. Ty byly tenkrát 3 a pak tam byli také 2 zástupci celozávodního výboru KSČ. Zabývala se rehabilitací těch, kterým bylo ublíženo v letech 1948 až 68 a během té své činnosti vlastně se jí podařilo zrušit desítky stranických trestů, potvrdila několik rehabilitací z jiných organizací. Zároveň spolupracovala s nestranickou fakultní rehabilitační komisí, ta byla děkanská a společně řešili asi 20 případů. A práce té komise se datuje od února 1968. Tam vlastně na celoplenárce komunistické strany vznikl požadavek, aby se strana vlastně jakoby podívala zpět a zreflektovala to období a přistoupila k nějakým rehabilitacím. A práce té komise vlastně skončila v listopadu 1968 a to z vůle komise trochu předčasně před dořešením některých případů. Oni sami to citují v té zprávě, takže po srpnové okupaci jsme se rozhodli neotálet a předložit rozhodnutí i naši závěrečnou zprávu ke schválení co nejdříve. Myslím, že tady se objevuje vlastně průvodní rys tohoto období, který je charakteristický pro Filozofickou fakultu a to je její určité zpoždění a pomalé nastartování na tu normalizaci. Tím, jak fakulta byla centrem Pražského jara, tak vlastně tam dlouho převládala nálada těch reformátorů a dlouho se čekalo, že tanky odjedou nebo zmizí, všechno se nějak zvrátí a vlastně také dlouho se hledali nějací lidé, kteří by dokázali provést potom jakoby tu další očistu po tom řezu. Takže teď vlastně jsme v období, kdy ještě všichni na fakultě si tak trochu myslí, že bude moct pokračovat ve snahách Pražského jara a proto také vlastně dokončují tu zprávu a rehabilitují vlastně své kolegy nebo studenty. Sami autoři zprávy konstatují, že vlastně, jak vidíte na tom slajdu, že ty křivdy a nepravosti Filozofické fakulty jsou vlastně smutnou historií stranické organizace a sami vlastně se také kladou určité už předem kritéria nebo vlastně toho, jak budou posuzovat tu situaci předtím. Z těch dokumentů vlastně je to nejdůkladnější asi zvážení toho, jakým způsobem bude probíhat reflexe a rehabilitace nebo zhodnocení toho minulého období. U těch dalších dokumentů už je to více roztříštěné, anebo je to neuspořádané. Není to tak jasné. Zde je vidět, že opravdu, jak to dělali vlastně ti samí straníci, kteří předtím prováděli v těch 50. letech nebo v tom 49. ty prověrky, takže to brali jako své osobní nějaké selhání a tento dokument a celá ta snaha byla vlastně v něčem očistit sami sebe a zároveň pomoci k reflexi té fakultě. Ta rehabilitační zpráva má vlastně strukturu po té dlouhé úvahové pasáži na začátku, vlastně zkoumá ty zásahy akčních výborů Národní fronty z roku 1948, studijní prověrky z roku 1949, persekuce z roku 1950 a 1951 a potom se podrobněji zabývá některými dílčími příklady a závěrečně končí v podstatě charakterizováním tehdejší nálady. To je ten druhý citát v tomto slajdu. Chraňme si naši dnešní činorodou solidaritu. Ona je nejen zdrojem sil a nadějí. Je dnes možná i jedinou účinnou zárukou naší morální sebezáchovy. Takže to je listopad roku 1968 a stranická analýza. No, v průběhu těch let 69 a 70 mnoho lidí na fakultě čekalo, jak se to vyvine. Zároveň se pokoušela strana dosadit si nový celozávodní výbor KSČ, který by byl vlastně tak trochu ještě reformní a ne ještě normalizační, ale v okamžiku, kdy v lednu roku 1970 byl zvolený děkanem Karel Gala, tak vlastně se překlápí to naladění té fakulty a dochází potom k tomu, že se už opravdu nalézá na fakultě několik, na začátku 5 lidí, kteří jsou ochotni spolupracovat s nadřízenými stranickými orgány, které vlastně chtějí zhodnotit tu dobu Pražského jara velmi kriticky. V podstatě vedlo to k tomu, že na fakultě z rozhodnutí vyšších orgánů bylo zrušeno, nejdřív byl rozpuštěn celozávodní výbor, to bylo v dubnu 70, potom se zrušila celá organizace stranická a všem členům strany, kterých bylo tehdy asi 350, bylo pozastaveno členství a museli všichni k těm prověrkám. Zároveň ty prověrky se na fakultě právě docela zasekly, protože tím, jak ti lidé hodně dlouho přemýšleli, co bude, tak nebyli úplně ochotní přistoupit na to, že když jsem přijela ta vojska Varšavské smlouvy, že to bylo v pořádku. A v podstatě tím pádem pohovory trvaly déle a když už někteří byli prověření, tak zase vyšší stranické orgány odmítali posvětit toto prověření. Takže říkali, že dokud si fakulta nesestaví tu analýzu, která zhodnotí její činnost v období 68 a 69, tak žádný další straník k těm 37 nebude vlastně prověřen. A to byl velký tlak, takže nakonec těch 5 lidí v tom zdravém jádru a pak těch 37 prověřených straníků opravdu celý rok tvrdě pracovalo a odevzdalo dokument, který má tady 700 stran, nedá se úplně přečíst, nedávno vyšel tiskem a v podstatě prošel u nadřízených orgánů vlastně docela dobře. Zároveň je to dokument, který je plný různých osobních útoků. Je tam záznam, kdo co řekl na které schůzi, co řekla Jiřina Šiklová o placení, neplacení stranických příspěvků a v podstatě ten dokument se stal vlastně rezervoárem informací proti konkrétním lidem a vlastně tak i působil v dalších letech. Existoval sice pouze v 5 kopiích, nikdy nebyl někde jakoby distribuován, ale všichni na fakultě, kteří tam zůstali a nemuseli odejít, se báli toho, že někdo na ně vytáhne, že na nějaké schůzi a že je to zaneseno v analýze, řekl něco, že nesouhlasí se vstupem vojsk a podobně. Jinak žánrově je to prostě velká směs a dezinterpretační materiál a bere si prostě materiál, slovní zásobu z různorodých diskurzů, najdeme tam biblické odkazy, píše se tam o fíkovém listu frazeologie, za který se někteří chtěli skrýt, nebo o spasitelském komplexu pravicových oportunistů. Používá se tam také válečný diskurs, mobilizace, dezerce, ještě hojnější je medicínský diskurs, takže vlastně v té analýze, když se popisuje to předchozí dění, tak stranická organizace připomíná charakteristiku jakési zhoubné choroby, kterou je třeba potřít či vyléčit. Pro srovnání ještě doplním, že tyto analýzy nevznikaly ta analýza nevznikala jenom na fakultě, bylo to vlastně pokyn i pro další instituce, ale my, když jsme se dostali k materiálům z jiných fakult, tak na Přírodovědecké fakultě je ta analýza 26 stránek, 26 stran a na matfizu, na matematicko-fyzikální fakultě má ta analýza v podstatě 7 stránek, což vidíte, že je velký rozdíl. Evidentně se s tím nepsali tak dlouho a pak to nemělo takové důsledky. Dostáváme se k poslednímu dokumentu, to je rehabilitační zpráva. V podstatě rehabilitační zpráva začala vznikat hned po 17. listopadu, nebo ne úplně hned po 17. listopadu, ale už v prosinci vznikly snahy, aby nějaká rehabilitační zpráva, která by zmapovala to období od roku 68 do roku 89, i to období od roku 48 do 68, tam vlastně vznikla. Práci na ní zahájila komise, která byla jmenovaná děkanem fakulty už v lednu 1990. Přijali mezi sebe i lidi, kteří byli po 68. z fakulty odstraněni a vlastně už v říjnu 1990 existovala první verze toho dokumentu. Všichni ji s napětím očekávali a ona byla vlastně čtena v aule Filozofické fakulty, která byla tehdy plná a vypadalo to, že se opravdu lámou ledy. Zazněly tam pak nějaké připomínky, ta komise je zapracovala a v lednu 1991, tam je chyba v tom slajdu, je přednesla na Akademickém senátu Filozofické fakulty, jenomže vlastně stalo se něco zvláštního. Za tu dobu od listopadu 89 do ledna roku 91 se na fakultě změnila atmosféra a vlastně už jenom ta komise chtěla dokončit tu rehabilitační zprávu, ale nikoliv ta fakulta, která vlastně něčem se nepřeklopila do nějaké diskontinuity proti tomu, co bylo před rokem 89, ale vlastně něčem i personálně, i duchem trochu zůstala vězet v 80. letech nebo v minulém režimu, nebo v něčem, co rozhodně nechce pravdivou reflexi toho, co se stalo, nebo nazvání toho, co se vlastně dělo. Takže Akademický senát a vedení fakulty doporučilo konzultovat rehabilitační zprávu s právníkem a právníci zkonstatovali, že to by se nemělo vydávat, ačkoliv jinak Akademický senát fakulty původně to chtěl vydat a rozdávat to všem, případně to prodávat. Už byl stanovený i náklad a tiskárna, ve které se to bude tisknout, ale publikace zprávy byla zamítnuta. Zpráva byla uložena do sekretariátu Akademického senátu, její početné přílohy se časem nějak ztratily a náhodně byla nalezena vlastně až po roce 2000 naším výzkumným týmem, což je trochu zázrak, tak jsme ji taky zkusili vydat, takže i ona vyšla teďka tiskem. Důležité vlastně pro vysvětlení toho, co se vlastně stalo, je podle mě v tom citátu, nebo v těch 2 citátech, které zde ještě na závěr svého příspěvku promítnu, to je z té rehabilitační zprávy. Ti, co jí sepisovali a ti, co hodlali jakoby přimět tu fakultu k rehabilitaci a k nahlédnutí toho, co se vlastně dělo, oni vlastně přistoupili hlavně na tezi nejsme jako oni a nechceme dělat to, co dělali oni a nebudeme tedy ostrakizovat nikoho, děti těch, kteří prostě působili nějaká příkoří nám a bohužel to došlo k tomu, že tenhle směr úvah se nepotkal s tím, jak vlastně přemýšlela ta fakulta, a ačkoliv snaha autorů té zprávy podle mě byla velmi záslužná a opírala se i o tu rehabilitační zprávu roku 68, protože měla společné autory, tak se to vlastně nepovedlo dovést do nějakého konce, který by byl transparentní a jasný. A je vidět, že prostě práce s pamětí je složitá, že s ní každý může pracovat vlastně trochu po svém a že rozhodně ani jako upřímná snaha o to tu paměť uchovat pak nevede k tomu, že je uchována. Děkuji vám za pozornost.
Thank you, Katka Volna, for an interesting presentation of the changing activities and reflections at your very own university. Moving on to our fourth speaker, Martin Tharp is also a PhD candidate at Charles University. He is doing a PhD at the Department of Historical Sociology in the Faculty of Humanistic Studies. And his talk will be on counterculture, counter-memory, counter-history. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. And thanks to the organisers for organising this conference, for bringing together two quite different aspects of experience and intellectual background, and also a quite beautiful space to hold a conference in under these crystal chandeliers. Though I'm mentioning the chandeliers for one specific reason. I don't know how old they are, because it's very possible that the crystal elements in them might have been made at the notorious prison workshop in Minkowice in North Bohemia, where during the 1950s many political prisoners worked, and even during the 70s and 80s a number of people quite intimately involved with Samizdat and underground culture were also sent grinding glass beads, extremely bad for the health. But it is also the sense of contrast I would like to bring up with the visual element here. As you can see, Czech viewers will recognize what this picture is taken from. I'll say very briefly, for those who don't, it is from the television show 30 Cases of Major Zeman, which was a police TV show in normalization era Czechoslovakia. This is the most notorious of the episodes because it shows members of an illegal rock group as drug addicts and terrorists, and it was made at precisely the same time as the famous trial of the Plastic People of the Universe, just to set things in order. Here. Anyway, I've used three different words down at the base of this, which are words that I would like to talk about right now, in the sense of words and things. I'm using that deliberately to evoke two authors who wrote books on the same title. One, Ernest Gellner, who wrote it earlier. He was on the left, and on the right, Michel Foucault, to talk about, and this is something, to be kind to the interpreters, this is the point where I'm going to talk about the questions of language, and how these terms that I used when I first wrote this in English, and how they were translated into Czech. I'm not criticizing the translation, because it is an extremely useful translation of them. And in fact, in many ways, I would like to thank whoever translated it into Czech, because it's helped me to organize how I wanted to think about the question of memory within the present Czech context, particularly with regard to the most recent history, that is, the period between 1970 and 1989. So what do I mean by this problem? Well, counter and opposition here. Counter, what is useful here is that I would not have translated it this way myself. I would have taken the term, because in Czech you can say kontrakultura, and I would have applied it to the others as a prefix. I would have actually created the neologisms kontrapamięć and kontrahistoria. However, what I think is worth mentioning is that the current practice on most levels of Czech memory discourse, from scholarly institutions down to the primary school classroom is based less on the sense that I want to talk about as a kontrapamięć, and more on the sense of oppositional memory. I will get more to that later. That it's the kontrapamięć, which I would say that it is to be considered not simply as in terms of an opposition, but as a memory that is in and of itself critical, a self-reflective critique of the memory, in the way that Foucault originally described the term. I would say, however, that I'm going to start going the opposite way by looking at the opposition at the bottom between the phrases working class and dzielnicki. And I'm going to ask this: how can I really say the same thing by saying working class in English and saying dzielnicki in Czech? The usefulness of it as a sociological category, I would say here that the example of the English term working class, as I'm using it here, is that it is useful, that the term exists. And can we apply it to an actual class? To an actual group of people? Yes, you possibly can. But what I found most useful is, as I said here, in meta-sociological understanding, as this language, as registering contrast of memory, contrast of experience, and, as I said here, the Western and the Eastern Marxist legacies. What I mean by this is a great amount of social analysis. I know that there has been mention made of Birmingham School of Cultural Analysis, which, it's true, is grounded very heavily on Marxist principles, and the Eastern, which I've given here in the Czech slang term Marxák, which referred to the compulsory lectures in scientific Marxism, very often at the institutions like Charles University. So why is it that I'm talking about this? Well, because I would say that this is a group, both as a term, the term existing as a social fact, the group to which it applies, more or less, and its current use in terms of the Czech language, that predominantly in recent years the term dělník or dělnický has become associated within educated discourse as a kind of connotation of a threat to the liberal order. From the early 90s onward. At the same time, in recent years, it has also moved towards a kind of right-wing, or purportedly right-wing, rejection of the liberal order, of the open society, such as I mentioned here, there exists in the Czech Republic a right-wing political party called the Workers' Social Justice Party. And I've said that it is, in many ways, it is, you could say, red-brown, combining various communist elements of social solidarity with right-wing elements of ethnic solidarity. I was thinking of using the example of the leaflet they were passing out the other day for the municipal and senate elections. Pražský dělník, however, I was too disgusted by it and put it in the recycling. So, my apologies. Sometimes personal memory can get in the way of research. But to return to the topic of this figure within post-communist and post-totalitarian discourse, I have created this phrase that I came up with, subaltern illiberalism. That is a rejection of the 90s open society consensus on the part of those who find themselves left on the margins of it. It can be interpreted in various ways. There is the famous interpretation by the Polish sociologist Piotr Sztomka about civilizational incompetence in terms of the legacy of Homo Sovieticus. Human material is too damaged to proceed further. Or from the other side, oh, my apologies. I have to hurry. Or the other side, the ethnographic stance, and less in sociology, of talking about the working class in terms of what has actually happened in this. Anyway, you can probably read this quickly, so I'm going to go on to the next slide.
Well, I can do it get faster.
Okay, thank you. All right. What I would say, though, for explaining the Czech situation is, while this process exists here, maybe not to the same extent as in other post-communist states, I would like to examine a few things about both the Czech situation, which could be extended to other states, but not necessarily. One is the example of forcible homogenization in the 20th century, these are the dates that are commonly mentioned. And the particularly ironic result of this, in terms of the end of totalitarian rule, but even during its final years, where there was such a desire to create a sort of unified and highly managed public space, including the management of memory, which was done not so much through propaganda, but through more subtle entertainment propaganda, such as the Major Zeman television series. At the same time, you see an increasing fragmentation along two lines, one of which is geographic. The areas where there was a continuation of social memory in terms of continuation of settlement. Traditional Czech areas. The other, the industrial areas of North Bohemia and North Moravia, former Sudetenland, where there was no continuity of settlement, and interestingly, and where it was also much easier to observe. I mentioned the French historian Muriel Bleve, who did a wonderful paper some years back, taken from the secret police archives in Ústí nad Labem in North Bohemia, where she was able to, they were following people's public conversations. The other is of the question of social networks versus the public sphere. When the public sphere is subjected to such intense manipulation, the social network becomes the carrier of memory. And what I would say, I'm probably not even going to get to the idea of the counterculture as a carrier of memory and as an actor within the memory process. So I'm going to diverge a little bit from what's in the abstract, just to bring up these ideas, to turn back to, as I said here, counter versus oppositional memory, that much of post-totalitarian scholarship is not about counter memory. It is about oppositional memory. It is about the uncovering of facts that were suppressed during the state social rule, or about the covering of facts to disrupt parts of social memory that still remain under the sway of the previous regime. And it leads to, I might even want to say this if I'm to conclude it before getting to the main topic, what you could call a privileging of memory within the post-totalitarian sphere, in which memory, because it was the receptacle of hidden inconvenient, suppressed, subalternated, palmodine truths, that memory receives a certain sense of privilege within both historiography and metahistoriography and society at large. But at the same time, it can be dangerous in terms of the appearance of a counter-memory that is on the part of those who have lost out in the change of systems, that actually rejects the entire system and sees it as a kind of truth as opposed to the pseudo-truths being generated by the mainstream discourse. So, having skipped over the part that I would have spoken about, I will just leave you with these two final questions. In fact, I would actually look at the very last part here, which is this. I used Richard Rorty's book title, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, to bring up one point that I think both those with experience of the open society and those experience of the closed society should keep in mind. And that was at the basis of this particular discussion. That the irony of it is of the use of Marxist-derived ideas within and against the legacy of Marxist tyranny for the simple reason of not creating a kind of intellectually closed system, but of leaving matters open for further discussion, even conflictual ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin Tharp, for those appropriate reflections now on also the concepts that we are using ourselves in this field, counter and oppositional memory. Our final speaker for this panel, I'm very pleased to present Cristina Petrescu, who is Associate Professor in Comparative Politics and Recent History in the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Bucharest. Thank you, Cristina.
Thank you, and thanks to the organizers. I will say in the beginning, to follow perhaps easier what I want to say, that this paper has, this presentation has three parts. The first presents what we can call a monologic memory of Romanian communism that is reflected in all public representations and in textbooks. The second presents a first challenge to this narrative that in the Romanian context appeared much later than in other former communist countries, that is around Romania's entry to the European Union. And the third part would try to put all these things in a comparative perspective. Now, how can one summarize this dominant narrative? I think it's very familiar to most people that actually experienced the exit from communism. This goes like Romanians were victims and heroes. Of course, the communist period was the darkest in national history, and Romanian dictatorship was the harshest in the entire Soviet bloc. So this is, of course, as I said, familiar, and it comes very much from a combination of let's say, traditional classic historical writing, which is ethnocentric, combined with the political and societal priorities of the transition. And because of the particularities of this, let's say, political and social priorities, the particular context of Romania, this narrative was, let's say, dominant for a longer period in Romania than in other countries. I have put that let's say, I tried to summarize this context on the slide. That goes like, we had a revolution in 1989 that was contested by many, considered not a genuine break with the past. And in order to have a genuine break, people in civil society as part of political parties asked for a transitional justice. This was postponed, and the substitute for transitional justice was considered the preservation of the memory of communist terror. That's why this is central in all public representations, and I underline public. This private remembering, it's totally different, of course. Now, what was considered worth remembering in post-communist Romania? Of course, first it's about the communist terror. The second, it's about the resistance to communism. That in Romania occurred mostly immediately after the communist takeover. There are a lot of problems about that. Professor Shafir hinted to that a little bit. I will not go into details here, but certainly these two things are making Romanians, let's say, victims and heroes. And the third issue that is somehow reflected partially also in public representation as well as in school books as a little bit of everyday life history, because this is of course a way of making historical writing a little bit more fashionable than simply political history. But in Romania this is centered on shortages that in this country existed in the 1950s as well as in the 1980s, and that made this country different. Now, who are the people that produced this, let's say, monologic memory? First of all, is the generation, it's of course a very simplified view, but we can consider that the main group that witnessed for the communist crimes are the people in the generation of 1947. That means people that were already mature at the communist takeover, and they experienced this period of terror. Those their peers, people in the same generation that were, let's say, in the Communist Party, expressed themselves publicly, but these memories were totally discarded as being, let's say, unlegitimate and were not included in the main narrative. Now we have a second generation that was born after the communist takeover, which I call generation of 68, that actually did not convey their own memories to the public, because these are memories that seemed indecent as compared to crimes. So they actually performed the, let's say, function of organizing this memory in public representation. And we have a third generation that I call the generation of 1989, the generation that actually experienced communism only as children or as teenagers. They are the first that, in fact, challenged this dominant narrative around Romania's entry in the European Union, when all these things seems to be really the past. And of course, because we talked about, let's say, social functions of the historians, if you haven't guessed, I do identify myself, of course, with this generation. I'm part of it. Now, what is this generation remembering? Of course, that I try to, again, make a kind of very simplified typology. Mostly, these are school memories. This is about what books we used to read. This is about the toys we had. This is about also the pioneer tie and other things like that. These types of memories are, in fact, positively evaluating the past, rather, if we are to, let's say, assess that. There are, of course, memories. There are a kind of, let's say, catalog of things of the past that have, in the meantime, disappeared, types of chocolates, of pastries, of toys. And so these exist everywhere, even, I think, in a non-communist world. And these are rather neutral evaluations of the past. The last type of recollections are actually connected with daily routines in Romania of the 1980s that were at that time modified to the absurd. In order to understand what I want to say, I will just give you a couple of examples of these, let's say, modified daily routines. We all know about the lines for food that will start at 3 o'clock in the morning. This happened everywhere in the communist world, yet in Romania of the 1980s, the shortages were so deep that Well, there were electricity cuts in the evening, so people remember that they used to make their homework at the gas lamp. There was so cold in the apartments during the winter that you have to sleep with your winter coat on. There was low gas pressure, so that's why you have to do, there were all the routines connected with cooking were totally distorted, and so on and so forth. Now, having in mind this, coming actually to the concluding part of my paper, that puts in comparison these memories with the memories of the, let's say, earlier generation in Romania. I say that, well, these memories are different in form, and this is pretty important. Of course, those of older people are in printed form, and those new are actually mostly expressed on the internet, and that's important. But these are not necessarily conflicting memories. I would say that they are rather complementary. Well, there is a different rationale behind remembering of these two generations. And there is a different way of narrating the past, a different mode of narrating the past. Whereas the story of the people in the generation of 45 was a tragedy, the story of the generation of 1989, it's rather self-ironical. Now, why I stress the idea of the internet is that these stories prove to be, we talked about the reaction of the students and how they get knowledge about the past. Well, they rather get knowledge of the past from the internet. And these stories are there on the internet, and it remains to be seen indeed what will come out of this interaction in the future. If we are to put these memories in comparison with, let's say, memories of the peers, the same generation in other former communist countries, we will see that, of course, they all remember some shortages. There were no bananas, we have to queue for that, and so on and so forth. But the daily routines modified to the absurd that I talked about do not exist in other memories. What means that? That we have, on the one hand, memories of sheltered resistance by Omar Barbesa. At the grandma's, everything was better. Versus memories of a grim presence of a dictatorship in everyday life. But I would argue that these memories are nostalgic, but nostalgic not for the communist past, but for the past before the internet. And it's indeed ironical that they are expressed on the internet, because they are talking about, I will finish in 1 minute, they are talking about the books that they used to read. That was a time when we were reading books. There was a time when we had friends instead of having only virtual connections through Facebook and so on and so forth. And there is one thing that is still a kind of project I haven't systematically looked into, but I try to compare that with similar memories emerging from, let's say, older democracies, from Western Europe in particular. And I would say that even here we can detect this nostalgia for the past before the internet, that in fact appeared on the world about the same time with the collapse of communism, and about the same time everywhere. It was just a little bit difference. And I think that what is interesting is that these memories are overlapping to a great extent in terms of, let's say, books and movies. Winnetou was read everywhere. Le Gendarme was popular everywhere. Walt Disney Productions also. Even Heidi was in, let's say, a version of cartoons in communist Romania. But what is uncommon, and that's really the final comment, is that this generation has found with this process of remembering a sense of collective identity, because it didn't identify itself with the other narrative. It actually was a narrative that provided for them moral orientation indeed, but there was, they felt that this is not actually their narrative. And also, and the collective sense of identity goes like we are the last generation that experienced both dictatorship and democracy. This is something, a useful asset for us. And that's why they assumed the mission of transmitting this to the next generation that never knew actually how our life was under a dictatorship. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Christina Petrescu, and thank you all the speakers for keeping so wonderfully in time, so that we now have 25 minutes for discussion, for questions. At this stage, once again, thank you for the speakers for your presentations so far, and thank you for the interpreters for interpreting so far. And I open the floor for questions and comments. Yes.
Thank you. I just have a comment regarding Martin Tharp's presentation concerning the idea of competing narratives of countries that underwent various different kinds of totalitarianisms. My experience is more with Hungary, and I just find that there, the experience of these competing narratives of the two totalitarianisms, one being the Horthy dictatorship, sort of morphing into the Nazi dictatorship of the Second World War, followed by communist dictatorship, that seems to be one of the greatest problems that would need to be tackled by a given society. The way these two narratives seem to be competing with each other, which one was worse, which one produced the more victims. Of the two narratives, how many victims and perpetrators are still active or around in the society?
I suppose I should answer, but I think it is also related to Professor Shafir's topic as well. Because, I mean, mentioning Hungary, you also mentioned even the Hungarian example of the Kisgazdasági Párt and the Nyilatkozati Párt, who were, I would say, in certain ways, in pre-war Hungary, they were two manifestations of a kind of similar social consensus, and the need of all of the post-totalitarian states to look back not just to the totalitarian experience, but even more so to the much more vivid experience of life before this control, and when there were in fact not just anti-democratic but openly xenophobic tendencies within these societies that still exist today. And I'd like to turn it maybe back to Professor Shafir. What do you have to say about this, particularly since your base of operations is in one of Europe's last ethnically mixed enclaves in Cluj-Kolozsvár? How would you say this plays out in terms of your own experience at a day-to-day level?
Difficult question to answer. It depends very much from what perspective you're looking at. Why, like everywhere else in Eastern Europe, or almost everywhere, one problem was solved in Romania, whether directly or indirectly, and that is a Jewish problem. Hitler solved it in his own way, and whatever was left practically moved away to other parts of the world. But still, as you say, in Romania there is still a small German minority, certainly small in order if you compare it with what was the case before and right after the war. And there are two large or larger minority, the Hungarian minority, but not to forget there is a Roma minority, which is much larger. Insofar as the German minority is concerned, not only has this minority somehow managed to be perceived in generally positive terms, but having studied a little bit the minorities as perceived by the concept of social distancing, that is, for those unfamiliar with it, you're asking the question, would you agree to have a gypsy visit Romania, which is easier, have a gypsy as your neighbor, slightly more difficult, have your daughter marry a gypsy, which of course is a lot more difficult. Having studied that, you can clearly see that the best image like perceived is the German minority, and like everywhere in Eastern Europe, including in this country, the worst is a Roma. The case of even the liberals, when it comes to, well, they would agree, the liberals I mean, to live in a neighborhood with assimilated Roma. But to have his daughter or her son marry a gypsy woman, even with the liberals you have problems. Now the Hungarian minority in Romania, it's no small problem. And that is on both sides of the spectrum. Everybody knows that the Hungarian minority, among its many trouble, is that it's not placed at the border with Hungary, or rather in the center of the country. They have kept demanding autonomy, self-government. Now, for Romanians, that self-government immediately sounds an alarming bell. There are always suspicion that is, in fact, this is a masked form of striving for independence. On the Hungarian side, there is a justified fear that things going on like they've been going on for the past, since 1918, in fact. In the next century there won't be any Hungarian left, because people will slowly but surely be assimilated, whether by force or by necessity. This, insofar as the minority problem is concerned, but because after all we are at this conference, come to speak of memory. What does an ethnic Hungarian in Romania remember? Of course, his own victims and his own heroes. Now, the problem is that they clash. It's the other way around, because his victims were Romania's heroes, and the other way around in many places. So even a simple commemoration, like the Hungarians commemorated a couple of days ago their generals executed in Arad, in 1948 by the Austrians. This is immediately perceived by the Romanian as if they commemorate those who fought to impose their rules on the Romania. Thank you very much. I've overpassed my time.
And I would like to thank the very interesting panel and first address a short comment to Lisa Krieg and the question of emotions. I would like to insert an information which I only got recently at a conference of people who are running memory sites. And they were discussing something that I had never heard of before. It was called the Beutelsbacher Konsens. And that was a consensus for people who work in these memory sites and also museums. And it is from 1977, and it laid out rules how to create these places. Just 1 page long. And number one norm or law was, it's called in German Überwältigungsverbot. So you're not allowed to overwhelm. It's against overwhelming the visitors. So it's interesting how we have gone from one extreme perhaps to the other, because that was only cognitively conceived. Emotions did not yet play any role at all, or memory or identity at that time. But now emotions have come back, and I think they're very complex, because on the one hand, if you see young people going to former concentration camps, first thing they want to see is the crematorium. So they don't follow the itinerary of the guide. They always go directly to what they consider the hotspot. And also Museum of Terror. There is no problem with emotions for them. That's what they're seeking. So may this discontent that you were talking about have to do with the discourse of guilt? Do they get mixed messages here? Do they feel implied in what they don't feel actually part in? And one brief comment on Martin Tharp. I was impressed when you talked about the unified and highly manageable public space of memory that was completely restored and recreated as a historical legacy of this country, maybe also of other communist countries. Could that also be a problem that we are still facing today? Because this is exactly the framework against which this whole group is, in a way, working.
Thank you for your comment and praise. I would agree that there is a question of memory and memory policy within, and that memory policy, as I thought, I was planning to talk about this in greater detail and I didn't, but that in terms of Erinnerung and Geschichtspolitik, and that generally speaking, in the German discourse on memory, Erinnerungspolitik is almost invariably, as I've found, associated with the activities of the German Democratic Republic in terms of its managing of not of history as it's taught, not of the facts, but of how people would remember it. And I think that there probably does persist a definite tendency in the post-totalitarian world to wish to manage people's memory and to they say, to work against forgetting, to work against nostalgia. And personally, I would say that that is not the right way to go about it. It would be to incorporate forgetting, to incorporate nostalgia, to incorporate these counter-memories, even incorporate the memories of those who actually had a good standing under communism, as a way of keeping open the field, and that I see it, the openness of the field is a much stronger guarantee of preserving an open society than simply trying to make sure that people remember the past of a closed society in the right way.
Thank you for that comment and the very interesting question. I would agree that a big part of the experiences of discomfort are indeed triggered by this narrative of guilt and being associated with this guilt. And I would say even more than that, that making this experience once might be enough for destroying a lot of following experiences, because this narrative of guilt is so strong and underlying that it can be triggered unintentionally very quickly. So I saw a lot of these conversations where like no one was like hinting at guilt or at responsibility or at feeling ashamed, but people would reply to this narrative as though they were assuming that it's there. So one has to be like really careful and knowing the background, and students really react to this underlying framework once it is created. And I agree that also many students and many young people, and I think many people who are interested in the Holocaust and these kind of violent pasts, they are seeking these emotional experiences, and that's also what keeps them fascinated, what keeps them doing research in their free time. But I think that there is a big difference in enabling this experience and creating the space for the students to have this experience, and to forcing it on them on the other side. So I think that's like, something that really should be avoided, but it's also true that it can be a very important and powerful and inspiring experience for people.
So I have one question here on the left, and then.
My name is George Marwan, or more exactly Jiří Marovan. It's exactly 60 years I entered the Faculty of Arts, so my memory and my experience with that faculty is quite different than that of the Czech speaker, Dr. Volná. We don't have too much time, so I am prepared to discuss this together after this meeting, and perhaps also I would like to have some chat about the Romanian Hungarians. I have recent experience with a similar problem. Thank you.
Comment? Circa here.
My question is addressed to Christina, but also to all the speakers in this conference who have been representing Poland, Estonia, Central European post-communist countries. This conference has been about memories of totalitarian regimes. And now, after all Central European countries, with the exception of Czechoslovakia, turned into authoritarian, nearly totalitarian regimes before the war. So is there any bridge in the memories? Living memories out, I know, people are dead, but there's cultural memory. Is there any bridge from the memories of the interwar totalitarian regimes and these totalitarian regimes imposed from outside, from Germany, Moscow, and so on?
You want to? I think that somehow Professor Shafir's presentation hinted at that. Now, all these countries have like similar past after the war. They were all in the Soviet bloc, but before, immediately before the war and during the war, the situation was different in each of these countries. In the case of Romania, there was a royal dictatorship that emerged just prior to the war. It lasted very shortly, only 2 years. And then it was a military fascist dictatorship during the war. And it is in this time that crimes, of course, against the Jewish and Roma minorities happened. And because of that, there is a kind of clash of memories in Romania that is, I think, not yet settled. Because Romanians wanted to remember their victims that were of Romanian origin, and because these are ours, after all, and they don't want to remember that they have been perpetrators against the Jewish minority. We have seen that, at least in Poland, there was a public debate that left some marks in textbooks. nothing like that happened in Romania. There was no public debate. Yet textbooks, I think, changed a little bit. And there is, maybe Professor Shapiro do not agree, I can talk from my personal experience of 10 years of teaching. And I can at least say that when I started teaching, you could not say that there was a Holocaust in Romania. There was, of course, communist dictatorships, Romanians were victims, but we could not care less about the Holocaust, and we, of course, that was a student's reaction, I mean. But now the reaction is, yes, we know that, we already learned that in high school, we accept that, or we are indifferent. So something had changed, but I don't think that things are, I don't know, witnessing any closure pretty soon. I don't know, so once again, in this respect, Romania is different from Czechoslovakia that was occupied by the Nazi during the war. It's different from Poland that was occupied by the Nazi and the Soviets during the war. It might be similar to Slovakia, it's similar to Croatia to some extent regarding this pre-war and war memories. And then thank you very much for the question.
Actually, if I would just add one response to that, I would myself say that there is a certain difference between the type of government that existed, that of course everyone talks about Czechoslovakia as an exemplary democracy between the wars. However, of course, when the Czech part became the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, of course Slovakia became a not particularly democratic state that nonetheless enjoyed a great deal of legitimacy within Slovak and specifically Slovak-speaking society. That's one point to remember. And secondly, that I would also say that the regimes in existence before 1938-1939 outside of Nazi Germany did not, to quite the same extent, share the sort of techniques of public manipulation that existed both within Nazi Germany and later within Soviet-style socialism. That there was repression, of course, but considerably less colonization of the mind within, I would say, pretty much all of these societies within Central Europe. But that's a matter that should be taken up at another time.
Your question, in fact, points to the problem which post-communist countries have, each in its own way and all together in general. Can you deal with one form of totalitarianism without dealing with the other form of totalitarianism? I mean, not that they are necessarily bound together, but the difficulty of people perceiving the necessity of defending democracy by taking the same attitude towards each of them, this seems to run against a stumbling war. I'll give you a very short example. Right after, a few years after the fall of communism, a Romanian writer who is in exile wrote an article about the communist past, the fascist past of one of Romania's most known historians of religion and artists. The reaction was very negative, and the woman who was perhaps a symbol of the struggle against communism, while working for the same institution that I used to work in that time, Radio Free Europe, wrote, we have had 45 years of communism and just 3 months of fascist dictatorship. which is of course not accurate either, but why should we care about fascism? We should struggle against communism. Her incapability of seeing the necessity of defending democracy at both sides of the spectrum is an illness that is prevalent in different degrees in most countries of East Central Europe, and if I might add my, of course, memorial subjective impression, what the worst case, by far the worst case, is Hungary, followed by the 3 Baltic countries. Thank you.
In the sense of a dialogic discussion, I have 2 more questions, comments, but we only have about 30 more seconds. So I would like to ask you perhaps to formulate as a question comment, so it's in the room, and perhaps we might have time for 1 answer. At the back.
My name is Alicia Likes. I will not lie, I'm not a historian, I'm a psychologist. The memory I used to work is short-time memory, long-time memory, and the memory you're talking about is for me like a hell lot long memory, something like this. So I have a question to Lisa Krieg and maybe more speakers who used to deal with the person of a teacher and educator. Because for me, so far, they were 2 quite slippery moments for those who want to teach history. First is playing with emotions and with students' emotions. And second is working with, used to say it, established views. I teach psychology to students who are going to be teachers. And one of the most important topics I used to teach them is stuff from social psychology. That the question of perception makes teachers as well as everybody very imperfective too. So, and there is no perception without contributions, and there is no perceptions with no mistakes. I'd like to ask if there is some way how to teach the history teachers how to play with students' emotions, not to how to tell it, not to make them mess in their heads, and how to work with their own views, like views, contributed views. Because this is the big part of social psychology, and so we have to understand that teachers are not perfect tools. Thank you.
I'll keep it really short. Thanks for your question. I possibly can't really answer it in 1 minute, but I was very lucky in my research, or maybe also unlucky, because I saw only very successful examples for Holocaust education. And the way that the educators that I witnessed played with emotions in their work was that they made space for emotions, but they didn't impose emotions or expectations about specific emotions on those that were educated in that space. And I think that is just a very successful combination. And on top of this, I think the idea of emotional capital can be very useful because it incorporates the educator's emotionality into the picture, because I think it does not work when you just come from the outside and you expect students or those who are educated to display emotions and open up to this total emotional experience, while you yourself are just an objective bystander. That doesn't work. I hope that answers it briefly. Maybe you want to talk to me later if you want to know more about that.
Thank you for that beautifully concise response. And before we thank finally the speakers and the interpreters once more, we start again at 3 o'clock after the lunch, and say a couple of small comments, and then we can thank you.
Yeah.
One small reminder, small shift in the program. Aleida Asman is going to speak as the closing keynote speaker at the next panel. So she'll be closing the conference as the last speaker. So lunch not provided here, open. They have some information on menus of the restaurants, I hope, at the entrance. So you may ask there, and let's meet here in a little bit less than an hour.